Incoming message.
Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, if you've spent any time at all looking into unexplained phenomena, you know the stories usually rely heavily on personal feelings and, spooky anecdotes. But today, we're going to fundamentally reframe that. I want us to adopt the lens of a forensic architectural investigator. We are going to take that subjective, vague feeling of spatial unease and literally translate it into observable, empirical field data. We aren't here for ghost stories today. We're here for a strict academic study on spatial behavioral patterns.
Okay, here is our agenda for today. We'll be looking at the spatial anomaly pattern, ruling out mechanical explanations, diving into responsive and adaptive behaviors, and then finally defining the occupation theory. Let's just jump right in.
You've probably heard this a million times. Almost every single field report we encounter begins with some variation of this exact phrase. This room felt wrong. Now, historically, researchers have just completely dismissed this. They chalk it up to common psychological explanations, right? Things like apophenia, where your brain is just desperately trying to find patterns in random noise, or maybe the person was exposed to low-frequency infrasound that caused a sudden sense of dread. But I want to challenge you to stop viewing this common confession as just some subjective feeling. Instead, what if we start analyzing it as actionable behavioral data? Think about it. When occupants consistently report an aversion to a specific space, that is a measurable shift in how that architecture is being used.
Popular media absolutely loves the idea of places that are just born haunted. Built on cursed ground, inherently evil from day one, the whole shebang. But the actual field data, it tells a completely different story. As we'll see, we really need to move away from this idea of inherent supernatural phenomena and move toward the concept of spaces that acquire an intelligence over time. It's kind of like a squatter secretly moving into a vacant building. These entities aren't born into the architecture. They actively develop an occupation within it over time.
So, Section 1, the spatial anomaly pattern. Let's observe how these entities actually map out their territories inside human homes. When you build a clear chronological tracking of specific, repeating spatial anomalies, an undeniable pattern emerges. They have a massive preference for corners. And this is across completely independent reports. Look at this. In June 2024, a family reported their child completely abandoning a totally comfortable bed to sleep exclusively in one specific corner of the room. Fast forward nearly a year later, in a totally different household, a child begins repetitively drawing an unknown symbol, and again, it is strictly localized to one single corner. Then, by April 2026, we see an actual physical environmental change, a static, measurable cold spot forming right in a room's corner. Now, when we categorize these seemingly isolated incidents, it reveals a really strict geographical clustering of activity. You're basically mapping the reported entity activity density within specific room layouts. Why corners? Well, corners provide two intersecting structural planes that offers the maximum amount of cover with the minimum amount of exposure. It's exactly like a spider building a web. They don't just build right in the center of the room, do they? No, they find structural intersections. And because of this corner preference, the human occupants organically begin to avoid that quadrant of the room. They are functionally shrinking the usable square footage of their own space. The floor plan efficiency is literally being altered by an unseen presence. Focusing on that April 2026 report for a second, we uncover a really fascinating piece of architectural history. The room in question was built in 1987, conforming to very specific late 20th century building design standards. Yet that localized cold spot we talked about, it didn't actually appear until 2023. That reveals an incredibly precise 36-year incubation period before the onset of the anomaly. This correlation between room age and the onset of observed activity is absolutely vital. It suggests that a space must properly settle, maybe physically, maybe energetically, before it actually becomes a viable habitat for them to move in.
All right, moving to Section 2, ruling out mechanical explanations. We have to be completely sure that these spatial shifts aren't just, structural flaws.
To be rigorous, we have to eliminate all mechanical and biological variables first. Let's look at the investigative techniques used in a specific case of aggressive wall scratching. Now, the occupants correctly assumed a natural cause first. Exterminators were brought in. They used thermal imaging, they set traps, 0 pests were found. Okay, so general contractors came in to check the framing for structural settling or maybe wind shear rubbing, 0 physical damage. Finally, investigators swept for high EMF fields that might be causing auditory hallucinations, 0 electrical anomalies. The physical integrity of the space was perfectly intact.
So, having completely ruled out the structure itself, we have to contrast standard animal activity with the behavior we're actually observing. Think about a raccoon or mice inside a wall. They operate on a constant primitive loop, right? They're largely unaware of you unless you make a sudden loud noise. But our data shows highly responsive behavior. That intense wall scratching, it ceased completely the exact millisecond a human entered the room, and it resumed the very moment they crossed the threshold to leave. That implies targeted spatial awareness. It is actively monitoring the room's perimeter. Which perfectly cues up Section 3, Responsive and Adaptive Behaviors. This is where we start treating the entity like an intelligent organism, adapting to a new habitat. This kitchen camera incident provides our absolute best concrete example of selective manifestation. A family set up a camera in their kitchen to catch activity. Step 1, the entity gave them exactly what they expected: 3 straight weeks of dead, boring baseline inactivity. It was literally waiting them out. Step 2, on the 4th week, verifiable physical manipulation finally occurred. A heavy glass fell straight down from the counter and shattered, with absolutely no draft or vibration to cause it. But it's step 3 that is terrifyingly clinical. Immediately after that physical event was captured, targeted digital malfunctions began. It transitioned from passive observation to physical action to active digital interference. This behavior reveals incredibly verifiable patterns of entity camera evasion. We're talking unexpected freezes, file corruption, active device resets. And here is the kicker. These malfunctions only occurred when the device was actively recording. If the camera was turned off, it functioned perfectly as a dormant piece of hardware. This shows a clear strategic learning curve against digital surveillance. To use an everyday analogy, it's exactly like a burglar learning the precise rotation of the security cameras so they can just slip right through the blind spots. The entity completely adapted to the digital environment. Finally, Section 4, the occupation theory defined. Let's synthesize all this raw spatial and behavioral data into our concluding thesis. So, what does this all mean? The crucial takeaway is that we are no longer looking at random, chaotic hauntings. The occupation theory defines this as an external intelligence deliberately selecting a space, sometimes literally waiting decades for the right conditions, learning its structural layout, learning its occupants' schedules, and then continuously adapting its tactics. The ultimate goal is to maintain its presence within that habitat while deliberately and intelligently evading definitive detection. The data clearly proves that the environmental impacts and the spatial evasions we've discussed today are not mere coincidences. That corner preference, it minimizes their exposure while maximizing their vantage point over the floor plan. The camera avoidance, that proves a working understanding of human surveillance tools. And the selective manifestation shows incredible patience. These actions are highly, highly strategic. These are the actions of something methodically, deliberately, and clinically occupying a habitat. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to turn our forensic lens back onto our own environments. We know they prefer corners. We know they require an incubation period to settle. You kind of have to look around your own spatial environment right now, at those cold spots you usually ignore, or those weird spaces your pets absolutely refuse to enter, and ask yourself this final clinical question. Does your room meet their criteria? And if it does, how long until they move in? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Stay observant.
Come to me, chickens, cock-a-doodle-doo!